The sun hung mercilessly in the cloudless sky, casting long shadows across the dusty main street of Clearwater Junction. It was late afternoon in the summer of 1870, and the small railroad town clung to life like a stubborn weed in the unforgiving landscape of the American frontier. To the west, gray mountains rose like ancient sentinels against the horizon, their peaks shrouded in a haze that might have been dust or distance. Samuel "Sam" Morrison guided his worn boots through the red dirt, each step raising small clouds that settled on his weathered chaps. At 32, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who'd seen enough hardship to know his own measure. His face, tanned by countless days under the desert sun, bore the lines of someone who'd learned to squint against more than just the glare. Once a prospector who'd chased dreams of gold in the California hills, Sam now made his living trading cattle and horses, moving between settlements like a ghost of better times. The town sprawled before him in typical frontier fashion, a collection of wooden buildings that seemed to lean against each other for support. The Grand Hotel, despite its ambitious name, was little more than a two-story structure with peeling paint. Next to it stood Murphy's General Store, its front porch cluttered with barrels and sacks of grain. The railroad depot anchored the eastern end of town, while saloons and gambling houses dominated the rest, their doors swinging open to release bursts of laughter and piano music into the scorching afternoon air. Sam had come to Clearwater Junction with simple intentions: sell his small herd of cattle to the Army procurement officer and buy fresh horses for the journey north. He'd done business here before, knew which merchants could be trusted and which saloons watered their whiskey. It was a rough place, but no rougher than any other town along the railroad. Here, a man's word was only as good as the gun on his hip, and justice often came at the end of a rope rather than from a judge's gavel. The livestock market occupied a large corral near the depot, and Sam spent the better part of the afternoon negotiating with Captain Hayes, a Union veteran who'd found steady work supplying beef to the frontier forts. They settled on a fair price, $800 for 20 head, and Sam tucked the bank draft into his vest pocket with satisfaction. It was enough to buy good horses and still have money for supplies and lodging. As evening approached, painting the sky in shades of orange and crimson, Sam wandered through the market area. Vendors hawked everything from ammunition to miracle tonics, their voices competing with the distant whistle of an approaching train. He paused at a saddlemaker's stall, running his hand over the smooth leather of a new rig, when an unusual sound caught his attention. From the direction of the Silver Dollar Saloon came a voice unlike the usual auction cries. It was rougher, tinged with something that made Sam's jaw tighten. Curiosity and an instinct honed by years on the frontier drew him toward the gathering crowd. The Silver Dollar was one of Clearwater Junction's seedier establishments, its windows grimy and its reputation worse. A crowd of perhaps 30 men had gathered in a rough semicircle near the saloon's side entrance, their faces flushed with drink and excitement. At the center stood Josiah Blackwood, a man Sam recognized as a local moneylender and sometime slave trader, though slavery had been outlawed. Men like Blackwood had found other ways to traffic in human misery. Blackwood was a thick-set man with greasy black hair and a voice that carried like a carnival barker's. He wore a brocade vest that had seen better days and a gold watch chain that glinted in the fading light. But it wasn't Blackwood that made Sam's blood run cold. It was what stood beside him. A young woman, perhaps 20 years old, stood with her wrists bound by iron shackles. Her dress, once blue calico, was torn and stained with dust and what might have been blood. Her feet were bare, bleeding from rough treatment, despite the dirt and dishevelment. Sam could see she had delicate features, high cheekbones, a straight nose, and eyes that might have been beautiful if they weren't filled with such desperate fear. "Gentlemen," Blackwood called out, his voice oily with false joviality. "Here we have a rare opportunity. This girl caught stealing, owing debts she can't pay, is bound for servitude to settle her accounts. The law allows for such arrangements, as you well know. Who'll start the bidding at $50? The crowd murmured and shifted. some men laughing coarsely, while others simply watched with the detached interest of those viewing livestock. Sam felt his stomach turn. He'd heard of such practices. Debtors forced into labor contracts that were slavery in all but name, but seeing it laid bare in the afternoon sun was something else entirely. The girl stood motionless, her head slightly bowed, but Sam noticed how her eyes darted frantically among the crowd, seeking something, perhaps mercy, perhaps simply a face that showed anything other than greed or indifference. When her gaze swept past him, he saw the full weight of her desperation, and something twisted in his chest. "Come now," Blackwood continued, yanking the chain that connected her shackles, causing her to stumble. "She's young, strong enough for household work or whatever else you might require." The implications in his tone were unmistakable, and several men in the crowd guffawed. Sam had seen enough cruelty in his life to know when to walk away, when getting involved would only bring trouble. But something about this moment, the girl's youth, the casual brutality of it all, or perhaps simply the weight of his own losses, kept his feet planted in the dust. As he stood there, wrestling with conscience and common sense, the girl's searching gaze found his again. This time, she held his stare for a long moment, her lips, cracked and dry, moved almost imperceptibly. At first, Sam thought she was praying, but then the crowd shifted, and he found himself closer to where she stood. That's when he heard it, barely a whisper, so soft it might have been his imagination if not for the way her eyes bored into his. "Please, buy me and take me away." The words hit Sam like a physical blow. In them, he heard not just desperation but a last, fragile hope. She wasn't asking to be saved. She was asking to be bought, accepting the only form of deliverance this harsh world might offer. The resignation in that acceptance was somehow worse than if she'd begged for rescue. Around him, the crowd continued its crude commentary. "Someone bid $60. Another voice called out $70. Blackwood's grin widened with each increase, his piggy eyes gleaming with avarice. Sam felt the weight of the bank draft in his vest, $800 meant for horses and a new start. He thought of the ranch he hoped to build up north, the quiet life he'd planned after years of wandering. Then he looked again at the girl, saw how she trembled despite the heat, saw the bruises on her arms that her torn sleeves couldn't quite hide. The bidding had reached $90. A heavy-set man in a stained leather apron, the local blacksmith. Sam recognized, seemed determined to win. The thought of what might await the girl in that man's custody made Sam's decision for him. $200, Sam heard himself say, his voice cutting through the chatter like a knife. The crowd turned to stare at him. Blackwood's eyes narrowed, taking in Sam's travel-worn appearance, clearly trying to assess whether this stranger could make good on such a sum. Well, Blackwood said, his grin returning. "Seems we have a serious bidder. Anyone else care to—" $300? Sam said flatly, pulling out the bank draft and holding it where Blackwood could see. Cash money. Today. A murmur ran through the crowd. $300 was more than most of them saw in a year. The blacksmith spat in the dust and turned away, unwilling or unable to match the price. Blackwood's eyes glittered with greed, but also with suspicion. "And what's a drifter like you want with—" "That's my business," Sam interrupted. "Do we have a deal or not?" For a moment, the only sounds were the distant piano from inside the saloon and the wind rattling a loose board somewhere. The girl stood perfectly still, but Sam could see the rapid rise and fall of her chest, the way her bound hands clenched and unclenched. "Sold," Blackwood finally declared, extending his hand for the draft. "Though I warn you, stranger, she's more trouble than she looks. Don't come crying to me when you realize what you've bought." Sam handed over the draft, watching as Blackwood examined it carefully before producing a ring of keys. The shackles fell away from the girl's wrists with a clatter that seemed too loud in the dusty street. She swayed slightly, as if the removal of the chains had taken away the only thing holding her upright. "She's yours," Blackwood said, already turning away to pocket his profit. "Good luck with her." The crowd began to disperse, some men muttering about the waste of good money. others placing bets on how long before the stranger regretted his purchase. Sam ignored them all, his attention fixed on the girl who now stood free but uncertain, rubbing her chafed wrists. "Can you walk?" he asked quietly. She nodded, though he could see the effort it took for her to stay standing. Without thinking, he shrugged off his coat and draped it around her shoulders, covering the worst of her torn dress. She flinched at first, then pulled the coat tighter around herself. "Come on," Sam said, turning away from the silver dollar and the leering faces. "Let's get out of here." As they walked slowly down the street, the sun finally dipping below the mountains and casting everything in deep shadow, Sam wondered what he'd just done. $300, a fortune to him, spent on a stranger whose name he didn't even know. Behind them, he could hear Blackwood's laughter carrying on the evening wind, and his final words echoed like a threat. "You'll regret this, stranger. Mark my words." But as Sam glanced at the girl walking beside him, saw the way she held her head a little higher despite her exhaustion, he thought that whatever came next, regret would have to wait. For now, they just needed to make it through the night. Sam led the girl away from the silver dollar, his mind racing with the implications of what he'd just done. $300, money meant for horses and supplies, now transformed into a human responsibility he hadn't sought. The weight of the remaining $500 in his pocket felt heavier than before, a reminder of plans derailed and futures uncertain. They walked in silence through Clearwater Junction's dusty streets, the girl matching his pace despite her obvious exhaustion. Sam's mind churned with questions and doubts. What had possessed him to intervene? He'd seen plenty of injustice in his years on the frontier. It was as common as tumbleweeds. Yet something about her whispered plea had cut through his carefully built walls. He glanced sideways at her, noting how she clutched his coat around her shoulders like armor. In the dying light, he could see more clearly the marks of her ordeal: a split lip, bruises darkening her jaw, scratches on her arms that spoke of struggle. His jaw tightened. Whatever debts Blackwood claimed she owed, no one deserved such treatment. "My name's Sam Morrison," he said finally, breaking the silence. "Reckon you should know that, considering—" She looked up at him, those desperate eyes now holding a flicker of something else. Wariness, perhaps, or confusion. When she spoke, her voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. Margaret O'Brien. Irish, Sam thought. That explained the fair skin beneath the dirt, the hints of red in her tangled hair. The Irish faced enough prejudice in the territories without adding Blackwood's brand of cruelty to it. They reached Morrison's boarding house, no relation. Despite the name, a modest establishment run by a stern widow who asked no questions as long as rent was paid in advance. Sam had stayed there before, knew it to be clean and respectable. He paid for 2 rooms, ignoring Mrs. Morrison's raised eyebrow at his companion's appearance. "See that she gets hot water for washing," Sam told the proprietress, sliding an extra $1 across the counter. "And maybe something that ain't been worn by someone else." "Mrs." Morrison's expression softened slightly. "I'll see what I can find," she said, her eyes taking in Margaret's condition with a woman's understanding. An hour later, Sam sat in the boarding house's small dining room, nursing a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. His mind kept circling back to Blackwood's words, the man's casual cruelty, the way the crowd had treated a human being like livestock. He'd left that life behind, or thought he had. The violence, the moral compromises of survival. Now here he was, thrust back into the thick of it. Margaret appeared in the doorway, and Sam barely recognized her, clean of dirt and blood, dressed in a simple brown dress that Mrs. Morrison had procured. She looked younger than he'd first thought, maybe 18, 19 at most. Her hair, now washed and pulled back, revealed delicate features that spoke of hardship endured but not yet hardened by it. She hesitated at the threshold until Sam gestured to the chair across from him. Mrs. Morrison appeared with a plate of stew and cornbread, setting it before Margaret without comment. The girl stared at the food as if afraid it might vanish. "Go on," Sam said quietly. "When's the last time you ate?" She didn't answer, just picked up the spoon with trembling hands and began to eat. Slowly at first, then with increasing desperation. Sam signaled Mrs. Morrison for more coffee and settled back to wait. Finally, when the plate was empty and some color had returned to her cheeks, Margaret spoke. "Why?" Sam understood the question. "Honest, I don't rightly know. Something about—" He trailed off, uncomfortable with examining his own motives too closely. "Didn't seem right, is all. Blackwood said I owed him money," she said, her voice stronger now, but still cautious. "Said I stole from him." "Did you?" Her eyes flashed with the first sign of spirit he'd seen. "No, never stole nothing in my life. My family. We had a small farm outside Millfield. Papa died 2 winters ago. Fever took him. Mama and my little brother Daniel and me. We tried to keep things going, but—" She paused, fingers tightening around the coffee cup. "Blackwood held the note on our land. When we couldn't make the payment, he came collecting." Sam had heard this story before, with variations. The frontier was full of widows and orphans ground beneath the wheels of progress and greed. "He said we could work off the debt," Margaret continued, her voice dropping. "Mama would cook and clean at his ranch, Daniel would tend the horses, and I—" She stopped, unable or unwilling to finish. "When Mama refused, when she tried to fight them off, there was an accident. She fell, hit her head." The words came faster now, as if a dam had broken. "Blackwood took Daniel anyway. Said I'd stolen from him when I tried to stop them. Had his men swear to it before the sheriff. Said I could work off the debt and the theft, or he'd see me hanged." Her hands were shaking again. "That was 3 weeks ago." Sam felt a cold fury building in his chest. Blackwood's operation was even fouler than he'd suspected, manufacturing debts, stealing children, forcing women into— He pushed the thought away. What mattered now was what came next. "Your brother," he said. "He's still at Blackwood's ranch?" Hope and fear warred in her eyes. "Far as I know. Unless he sold him off too?" Sam made a decision that he knew would likely get him killed, but he'd already crossed the line when he'd spent $300 on conscience. Might as well see it through. "We're leaving town tomorrow," he said. "First light, but we ain't going north like I planned." Margaret looked at him, understanding dawning. "You can't mean to— Blackwood's ranch is a day's ride west. We'll need supplies, and I'll need to buy those horses after all." He met her gaze steadily. "I won't promise we'll get your brother back. Won't promise we'll even survive trying. But I can't ride away knowing he's there." Tears welled in her eyes. The first he'd seen. "I can't ask you to." "You didn't ask. I'm offering." Sam stood, suddenly uncomfortable with the gratitude in her face. "Get some rest. Tomorrow's going to be a hard day." He turned to leave, but her voice stopped him. "Mr. Morrison? Sam?" When he looked back, she was standing, his coat still draped around her shoulders. "I meant what I said back there, about taking me away. Even if you'd had other intentions, it would have been better than what waited for me with Blackwood." The implication in her words made him uncomfortable. "I ain't that kind of man. Miss O'Brien, what I paid for was your freedom. Nothing more. You don't owe me anything." "Don't I?" She smiled sadly. "In this world, everybody owes somebody something. At least with you. I know the price." Sam left her there, retreating to his own room with thoughts as turbulent as a desert storm. He'd lived by a simple code these past years. Mind your own business. Avoid trouble. Survive. In one afternoon, he'd shattered all 3 principles. And for what? A girl whose problems weren't his, whose gratitude felt like chains of its own. He lay on the narrow bed, staring at the water-stained ceiling. Outside, Clearwater Junction went about its nightly business, shouts from the saloons, the occasional gunshot, the whistle of a late train. Normal frontier sounds that now seemed to carry an edge of menace. Sam knew Blackwood's type. The man wouldn't let this go. $300 or not, his pride had been pricked in front of the town. There'd be men watching, maybe already reporting back. They'd need to move fast and smart. He thought about the ranch he'd dreamed of building, the quiet life he'd planned. Funny how quickly dreams could turn to dust out here. But then he remembered Margaret's eyes, the desperate hope when he'd mentioned her brother, and knew he couldn't have chosen differently. Some chains, once seen, demanded breaking. Tomorrow would bring its own troubles, finding horses, gathering supplies, avoiding Blackwood's men, and then the bigger challenge, infiltrating a fortified ranch to rescue a boy who might not even be alive. It was foolishness bordering on suicide, but Sam had survived worse odds, back in his prospecting days, back during the war, and this time, at least, he'd be fighting for something more than gold or glory. That had to count for something, even in a world as hard as this one. As sleep finally took him, his last thought was of Margaret's words, "Please, buy me and take me away." He'd done the first part. Now came the harder task, keeping them both alive long enough to accomplish the second. Outside his window, a coyote howled in the distance, its lonely cry echoing across the desert. Storm clouds gathered on the horizon, promising rain or worse. Sam slept fitfully, his dreams full of iron chains and desperate eyes, while somewhere in the boarding house, a young woman sat by her window, clutching a stranger's coat and daring to hope. The moon hung like a silver dollar in the cloudless sky, casting pale light across the desert landscape. Sam had found a sheltered spot 5 miles outside Clearwater Junction, a cluster of rocks that formed a natural windbreak. They'd ridden hard since leaving town before dawn, and both horses needed rest. He built a small fire, careful to use dry wood that would produce little smoke. Margaret sat across from him, still wearing the brown dress Mrs. Morrison had provided, though Sam had insisted she take his spare shirt and an old pair of trousers for riding. She'd proven surprisingly capable in the saddle, though he could see the exhaustion in the way she held herself. "We'll rest here a few hours," Sam said, checking the loads in his Winchester. "Should reach Millfield by tomorrow afternoon if we keep this pace." Margaret nodded, her eyes reflecting the firelight. The past day had revealed more of her character. She complained little, did what was asked, and showed a practical intelligence that reminded Sam why frontier women were often tougher than the men. "Tell me about your brother," Sam said, partly to keep her spirits up, partly because he needed to know what kind of boy they were trying to rescue. A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "Daniel's 12, small for his age, but clever, always reading when he could get books. Papa used to say he'd make a fine lawyer someday. If we could send him back east for schooling." The smile faded. "Blackwood's probably got him mucking stables, if he's lucky." Sam didn't voice the darker possibilities. He'd seen what men like Blackwood did with orphaned children. Instead, he pulled out the map he'd bought in town, spreading it near the fire. "Blackwood's ranch is here, near Coyote Springs. 20 men, maybe more. According to the stableman I talked to, main house, bunkhouse, barn, and corrals. Pretty standard layout." "You're planning to ride in there with just the two of us?" Margaret asked. "Not planning to ride in at all," Sam replied. "Man like Blackwood expects frontal assault or legal challenge, won't expect someone to play his own game against him." Before Margaret could ask what he meant, a sound made them both freeze, the distant rhythm of hoofbeats. Multiple riders moving fast. Sam immediately kicked dirt over the fire, plunging them into darkness. "Behind the rocks?" he whispered, grabbing his rifle. "Quick now!" They scrambled into the deeper shadows of the rock formation. Sam positioned himself where he could see the approach. Margaret pressed close behind him. The hoofbeats grew louder, and soon he could make out shapes in the moonlight. 4 riders, moving with purpose. Said they headed west. One voice carried on the still air. "Blackwood wants the girl back, says she knows where some hidden money is." "Hidden money, my ass," another rider snorted. "He just don't like being shown up by some drifter." They passed within 50 yards of the hidden camp. close enough that Sam could see the glint of metal from their weapons. He felt Margaret trembling behind him, her hand gripping his arm. They waited, breathing shallow, until the riders vanished into the darkness. "They'll be back," Sam said quietly. "When they don't find us on the main trail, they'll start checking the likely camping spots." "We should keep moving," Margaret said. Sam shook his head. "Horses need rest, and riding at night in this terrain is asking for a broken neck. We'll wait another hour, then circle back east before cutting south. Throw them off our trail." They sat in the darkness, sharing water from Sam's canteen. The desert night had turned cold, and Margaret shivered despite the coat. Without thinking, Sam shifted closer, letting her lean against him for warmth. She stiffened at first, then gradually relaxed. "Why are you doing this?" she asked after a long silence. "Really, not just helping me, but risking everything for a boy you've never met." Sam considered the question. "Had a younger sister once, Sarah. Fever took her when she was about your brother's age." He rarely spoke of his past, but something about the darkness and their shared danger loosened his tongue. "Always wondered if I could have done more. Gotten her to a doctor faster. Something. Can't help Sarah now, but maybe you can help Daniel." Margaret finished softly. "Something like that." She was quiet for a moment, then said, "I'm not really a thief, you know, but if I had to be, I'd steal my brother back." "Wouldn't be stealing," Sam corrected. "Just taking back what's yours." They waited until the Big Dipper had turned a full hour before saddling the horses again. Sam led them east, backtracking carefully, then cut south through a narrow canyon he'd noticed on the map. The detour would add miles to their journey, but it might buy them time. As they rode, Margaret told him more about her family's farm, about the life they'd built before Blackwood's shadow fell over them. Sam found himself drawn into her stories, imagining a small homestead with a vegetable garden, chickens in the yard, a place where children could grow up safe. It wasn't so different from his own half-formed dreams. Dawn found them in the foothills, following a dried stream bed that provided some cover. Sam called a halt near a cluster of cottonwoods, one of the few spots of green in the harsh landscape. "We'll rest the horses again," he said, dismounting. "There's a trading post about 10 miles south. Man who runs it owes me a favor. We can get supplies, maybe some information." Margaret slid from her saddle, wincing slightly. She wasn't used to long hours riding, but she didn't complain. "What kind of favor?" "Pulled his son out of a flash flood couple years back. He said if I ever needed anything." Sam shrugged. Time to collect. They watered the horses from a small spring, then sat in the shade of the cottonwoods. Sam pulled out some jerky and hardtack, the traveling food of the frontier. Margaret ate mechanically, her mind clearly elsewhere. "What if he's not there?" she asked suddenly. "What if Blackwood already sold him? Or then we find out where he went?" Sam said firmly, "Blackwood keeps records. Same as any businessman. We get those records. We find your brother." "You make it sound simple. Simple and easy ain't the same thing." Sam checked his weapons again, a habit born of years staying alive in rough country. "Nothing about this is easy. But most things worth doing aren't." Margaret looked at him with something like wonder. "I don't understand you. Most men would have walked away from that auction. The ones who wouldn't, they'd have wanted something in return." Sam met her gaze steadily. "I told you, you don't owe me anything." "But why?" She seemed genuinely puzzled. "In this world, nobody does something for nothing." Sam thought about it, trying to find words for something he barely understood himself. "Maybe I'm tired of that world. Maybe I want to prove it doesn't always have to be that way." He stood, dusting off his pants. "Or maybe I'm just a fool who can't mind his own business. Either way, we've got ground to cover." As they prepared to ride out, Margaret caught his arm. "Sam, whatever your reasons, thank you. Even if we fail, even if at least someone tried, that matters." He nodded, uncomfortable with gratitude he wasn't sure he deserved. "Save the thanks for when your brother's safe. We've got a long way to go yet." They mounted up and rode out of the cottonwoods, back into the harsh light of day. Behind them, dust on the horizon suggested their pursuers hadn't given up. Ahead lay Blackwood's domain, where a boy waited in captivity and dangerous men guarded their ill-gotten gains. Sam touched the Colt at his hip, checking its familiar weight. He'd avoided violence for years, content to drift and trade and mind his own business. But some things, once seen, couldn't be ignored. Some chains, once recognized, had to be broken. Beside him, Margaret rode with new determination. No longer the desperate girl he'd bought at auction, but a woman with purpose. They made an unlikely pair, the drifting cowboy and the Irish farm girl. But Sam had seen stranger partnerships forged in the crucible of the frontier. The sun climbed higher, baking the earth and raising shimmers of heat from the rocks. Somewhere ahead, Blackwood waited in his stolen kingdom, confident in his power and cruelty. He wouldn't expect what was coming. Not a rescue, but a reckoning. Sam allowed himself a grim smile. The man who'd ridden into Clearwater Junction wanting only to trade cattle and buy horses was gone. In his place rode someone harder, someone with a purpose beyond mere survival. Whether that made him a better man or just a different kind of fool remained to be seen. The desert stretched endlessly before them, beautiful and merciless as only the frontier could be. They rode on, two small figures against the vastness, carrying hope as fragile as water in this dry land. The desert showed no mercy. By midday, the sun had transformed the landscape into a shimmering hell of heat and stone. Sam's shirt clung to his back with sweat, and he could see Margaret swaying slightly in her saddle, her face flushed beneath the wide-brimmed hat he'd insisted she wear. They'd been pushing hard for 2 days now, skirting the main trails and camping without fires. The trading post Sam had hoped to reach had been burned out, whether by Apache raiders or Blackwood's men. He couldn't tell. Only blackened timbers remained, a stark reminder of how quickly civilization could vanish in this unforgiving land. Their water was running dangerously low. Sam rationed it carefully, giving Margaret the larger share despite her protests. The horses suffered worst of all, their heads hanging low, foam flecking their bits. There, Sam pointed to a line of green barely visible through the heat shimmer. Box Canyon about 2 miles ahead. Should be water there. Margaret nodded, too exhausted to speak. Her lips were cracked, her skin burned despite the hat's protection. But she hadn't complained once, hadn't asked to stop or turn back. Sam's respect for her grew with each passing mile. They reached the canyon as the sun began its descent toward the western mountains. A small spring trickled from the rocks, feeding a pool barely 3 feet across. The horses rushed forward, and Sam had to hold them back, letting them drink slowly to avoid colic. "We'll camp here tonight," he said, studying the canyon walls. "Only one way in or out, defensible if necessary, but also a potential trap." Margaret slid from her saddle and immediately knelt by the spring, cupping water in her hands. Sam watched the canyon entrance while she drank, his rifle ready. The pursuit had been strangely absent since that first night, which worried him more than constant pressure would have, as twilight painted the rocks purple and gold. Sam made a small fire in a natural depression that would hide the light. He'd shot a rabbit earlier, and the smell of roasting meat made his stomach clench with hunger. "How much further?" Margaret asked, accepting her portion gratefully. "Day and a half to Blackwood's ranch, if we push hard." Sam studied her face in the firelight. "You holding up?" She managed a tired smile. "I've been through worse." "Have you?" He meant it as a light comment, but her expression darkened. "Those 3 weeks with Blackwood's men." She stared into the fire. "Yes, I've been through worse." Sam didn't press. Some stories didn't need telling. Instead, he pulled out the last of their coffee, brewing it strong and black. They sat in companionable silence, listening to the desert come alive with the night sounds, the distant yip of coyotes, the rustle of small creatures in the brush. "Tell me about your plans," Margaret said suddenly. "Before all this, you mentioned a ranch up north?" Sam leaned back against a smooth boulder, surprised by how easy it was to talk to her. "Montana territory. Man I knew wrote about land opening up near the Yellowstone. Good grass, plenty of water. Place where a man could build something lasting. Sounds peaceful. That was the idea. He sipped the bitter coffee. Spent too many years chasing gold, living rough. Figured it was time to put down roots, maybe raise some horses. Nothing fancy, just permanent. Margaret drew her knees up, wrapping her arms around them. I used to dream about going to a city, San Francisco, maybe, or even back east, somewhere with theaters and libraries and streets that didn't turn to mud every spring. She laughed softly. Seems foolish now. Dreams ain't foolish. Sometimes they're all that keeps us going. What about now? Your dreams? I mean, I've ruined them. Haven't I? Sam considered the question. Plans change. Maybe they needed changing. He met her eyes across the fire. Can't build much of a life if you can't live with yourself. Riding away from you and your brother, that would have poisoned any dream I had. A comfortable silence fell between them. The fire crackled, sending sparks spiraling up toward the star-filled sky. Sam found himself studying Margaret's profile, the way the firelight caught the copper threads in her hair. She'd proven herself tougher than he'd expected. Braver, too, under different circumstances. He pushed the thought away. Now wasn't the time for such considerations. We should turn in, he said. Want to be moving before dawn. Margaret nodded, but made no move to rise. Sam, what happens after? If we get Daniel back? I mean, we can't go back to our farm. Blackwood owns it now, and we'll be fugitives. It was a fair question. One Sam had been avoiding. One problem at a time. Get your brother safe first, then we'll figure out the rest. We? The word hung between them, loaded with implications. Sam cleared his throat. You'll need help getting somewhere safe. California, maybe, or Oregon. Somewhere Blackwood's reach don't extend. And you? I'll see you settled. Then, he shrugged. Then we'll see. Margaret stood, brushing dust from her borrowed trousers. That ranch in Montana? Does it have to be just horses? Before Sam could answer, she'd moved to her bedroll, leaving him to puzzle over her meaning. He sat up a while longer, keeping watch and thinking. The simple transaction he'd made in Clearwater Junction had become something far more complex. He'd bought her freedom, but somewhere along the trail, she'd begun to claim a piece of his. The night passed peacefully, but Sam woke before dawn with instincts screaming. He lay still, hand moving slowly to his gun, listening. There, the soft chink of a horseshoe on stone, barely audible. He rolled to Margaret, clamping a hand over her mouth as her eyes flew open. Company, he breathed in her ear. Stay down. Sam belly-crawled to a gap in the rocks, peering out. 3 riders were approaching the canyon entrance, moving cautiously. Even in the pre-dawn darkness, he recognized the bulky form of Blackwood's foreman, a man named Garrett he'd had dealings with years ago. No love lost there? The riders paused at the canyon mouth, conferring in low voices. Sam weighed their options. 3 men, confined space. Margaret to protect, not good odds. But they'd been in worse spots. Then Garrett's voice carried clearly. They're in there. Horses are still hobbled. Take positions. When the sun comes up, we'll have clear shots. Sam crawled back to Margaret. Can you ride bareback? Her eyes widened, but she nodded. When I start shooting, you run for your horse. Don't saddle him. Just get on and ride hard back the way we came. There's a town called Millbrook about 30 miles east. Sheriff there is honest. Tell him, I'm not leaving you. This ain't a discussion. His voice was harder than he intended. Your brother needs you alive. He needs us both alive. She gripped his arm. I can shoot. Papa taught me. Sam wanted to argue, but time was running out. The eastern sky was already lightening. He handed her his backup revolver. 38 Smith & Wesson. Stay behind the rocks. Only shoot if they get past me. He positioned himself behind a boulder that gave him a view of the canyon entrance. The riders had dismounted, taking cover positions of their own. A classic siege situation. They could wait him out. Let thirst and hunger do their work. But Garrett had made one mistake. In the growing light, Sam could see the horses the men had left ground-tied about 50 yards back, cut off their mounts, and the hunters became the hunted in this unforgiving terrain. The sun crept above the canyon rim, sending long shadows across the ground. Sam waited, patient as the rocks themselves. Then Garrett showed himself, probably thinking distance made him safe. Sam's Winchester cracked, the sound echoing off the canyon walls. Garrett spun and fell, clutching his shoulder. The other two men opened fire, bullets whining off the rocks around Sam's position. "The horses!" Sam shouted to Margaret, then laid down covering fire. To his amazement, she didn't run for their own mounts. Instead, she sprinted along the canyon wall, using every bit of cover, firing the .38 to keep the attackers' heads down. Sam realized what she intended and cursed her courage even as he admired it. His rifle spoke steadily, controlled shots that kept the two remaining gunmen pinned. Margaret reached a position where she could see their horses. The .38 barked twice, and the animals bolted, reins trailing as they galloped into the desert. One of Blackwood's men broke cover, trying to catch a horse. Sam's bullet caught him in the leg, sending him sprawling. The third man, seeing the situation deteriorating, made a run for the canyon entrance. Margaret stepped out from cover, the revolver steady in her hands. "Stop right there." The man froze, caught between her and Sam's rifle. His hands went up slowly. Sam approached carefully, keeping his weapon trained. Garrett was groaning, trying to crawl toward a dropped pistol. Sam kicked it away. "Margaret, get our horses ready. We're leaving." She moved quickly, her face pale but determined. Sam tied the uninjured gunman's hands, then roughly bandaged Garrett's shoulder. "You boys can walk back," he said. "Tell Blackwood he'd best forget about the girl. She's under my protection now." Garrett glared at him through pain-narrowed eyes. "You're a dead man. Morrison, Blackwood's got 20 guns. You can't protect her from all of us." "Maybe not." Sam retrieved their weapons, tossing them far into the rocks. "But I'll take a fair number with me trying. You tell him that." They rode out of the canyon as the sun climbed higher, leaving the three men to their long walk. Sam knew they'd just escalated the situation, but there'd been no choice. At least now Blackwood knew they weren't easy prey. Miles from the canyon, Margaret finally spoke. "I could have killed him. That man at the entrance, I had a clear shot." "But you didn't." "No." She was quiet for a moment. "Does that make me weak?" Sam thought of all the men he'd known who'd found killing easy, and what it had done to them. "No, makes you human. There's a difference between defending yourself and taking a life in cold blood. Hope you never learn how easy it can become." They rode on through the increasing heat, both knowing the confrontation had been merely a skirmish. The real battle lay ahead, at Blackwood's ranch, where a boy waited and hard men stood ready to defend their employer's cruel empire. But something had changed. Margaret had proven herself not just a victim to be protected, but a partner to rely on. And Sam, who'd spent years avoiding connections, found himself grateful for her steady presence at his side. The desert stretched endlessly ahead, but for the first time since leaving Clearwater Junction, Sam felt they might actually have a chance. The pursuit came with the fury of a desert storm. They'd barely covered 5 miles from the canyon when Sam spotted the dust cloud rising behind them, too large for 3 men on foot. Blackwood had sent reinforcements. "Ride!" Sam shouted, spurring his tired horse into a gallop. They thundered across the hardpan, weaving between stands of Joshua trees and jumping narrow arroyos. Margaret rode like she was born to it, her fear transformed into determination. But their horses were exhausted from days of hard travel, while their pursuers had fresh mounts. Bullets whined past, kicking up spurts of dust. Sam twisted in his saddle, firing back to discourage close pursuit, but he knew they couldn't outrun them. Not on open ground. "There!" Margaret pointed to a cluster of massive red rocks rising from the desert floor like ancient ruins. "We can make a stand." Sam nodded, steering toward the formation. It was their only chance. They reached the rocks as the first riders came within accurate rifle range. sliding from their saddles and pulling the horses into cover. The rocks formed a natural fortress, with narrow passages between towering sandstone walls. Sam quickly surveyed their position, defensible, but limited escape routes. They'd have to hold until nightfall and hope to slip away in darkness. "How much ammunition?" Margaret asked, checking the .38. "Maybe 40 rounds for the Winchester, 20 for the Colt. Not enough for a prolonged siege." "You?" "8 shots left." Sam grimaced. They'd have to make every bullet count. He positioned himself at a gap overlooking the approach, while Margaret took a spot covering their flank. The attackers. Sam counted at least 8 spread out, taking positions behind whatever cover they could find. For a moment, an eerie silence fell over the desert, broken only by the harsh breathing of their winded horses. Then Blackwood's voice boomed across the distance. The man himself had come. "Morrison, you've caused me considerable trouble. 3 of my men injured, horses stolen, and you've taken property that belongs to me." "Nobody belongs to you, Blackwood," Sam called back. "The girl's free. You got your money. The girl knows things, saw things. She comes back, or you both die out here." Margaret appeared at Sam's shoulder. "He's afraid," she whispered. "There's something he doesn't want getting out." "What did you see?" Sam asked quietly. Her face went pale. "The night Mama died? It wasn't an accident. Blackwood himself. I saw him push her, and there's more. He's been working with someone, falsifying land claims, stealing from homesteaders. I heard names, saw documents." Sam understood now. This wasn't just about wounded pride or lost property. Blackwood was protecting a larger operation, and Margaret was a dangerous witness. "Listen up, Blackwood," Sam shouted. "The girl's already told me everything. You kill us. I've arranged for the information to reach the federal marshal in Tucson. Your only play is to let us ride away." It was a bluff. But sometimes bluffs were all you had. Blackwood's laugh was ugly. "Nice try, Morrison. But you didn't have time to arrange anything. Boys, burn them out." Fire arrows began arcing through the air, most falling short, but some landing dangerously close to their position. The dry brush around the rocks caught quickly, smoke beginning to drift across their makeshift fort. "They're trying to smoke us into the open," Sam said, coughing as acrid fumes stung his eyes. The attack intensified. Rifles cracked from multiple positions, keeping Sam and Margaret pinned while the smoke thickened. Sam fired back when he could, trying to conserve ammunition, but the situation was deteriorating rapidly. Then Margaret grabbed his arm. "The horses!" The animals were panicking, eyes rolling white as the smoke surrounded them. If they bolted, any chance of escape died with them. Margaret ran to calm them, crooning softly despite the bullets sparking off nearby rocks. A figure appeared through the smoke. One of Blackwood's men had circled around. He raised his rifle toward Margaret. Sam's Colt roared, and the man spun away into the haze, but more were coming. Sam could hear them working through the rock passages, trying to flank their position. He grabbed Margaret, pulling her deeper into the stone maze. "We need to move, now." They led the horses through a narrow cleft, barely wide enough for the animals to pass. Behind them, shouts indicated their escape had been discovered. The smoke was a blessing now, providing cover as they worked their way through the labyrinth of stone. They emerged on the far side of the formation as the sun touched the western horizon. Open desert stretched before them, offering no cover for miles. But to the north, Sam spotted something that made his heart leap. A dust devil, one of those desert whirlwinds that could swallow riders whole. "Can you ride through that?" he asked Margaret. She looked at the swirling column of dust and debris, then back at the smoke and flames behind them. "Do we have a choice?" They mounted and spurred toward the dust devil. Behind them, Blackwood's men burst from the rocks, shouting and firing. Sam felt a bullet tug at his shirt sleeve. Another crease his saddle. Then they plunged into the whirlwind. The world disappeared in a chaos of stinging sand and howling wind. Sam could barely see Margaret riding beside him, her form ghostly in the swirling dust. They rode blind, trusting their horses' instincts. While the tornado of grit provided perfect concealment, When they finally emerged on the far side, Sam looked back. The dust devil had moved on, but it had done its job. Their pursuers had lost them in the storm of sand. As darkness fell, they had a chance. But Margaret was slumped in her saddle, one hand pressed to her side. In the dying light, Sam saw blood seeping between her fingers. "No," he breathed, catching her as she started to fall. "Just a graze," she managed, but her face was white with pain. Sam found a shallow wash that would hide them from casual observation. He helped Margaret down, his hands shaking as he examined the wound. The bullet had carved a furrow along her ribs, painful and bloody, but not immediately life-threatening if kept clean. "This is going to hurt," he warned, pouring precious water over the wound. Margaret bit down on a piece of leather as he cleaned and bandaged the injury with strips torn from his spare shirt. She didn't cry out, but tears leaked from the corners of her eyes. "I'm sorry," Sam said, the words inadequate. "This is my fault. Should have found another way." "Stop," Margaret said weakly. "You gave me hope when I had none. You're risking everything for a boy you've never met. Don't you dare apologize." Sam built a small fire, risking the light to brew some willow bark tea for the pain. As Margaret dozed fitfully, he kept watch, his mind racing. They were hurt, exhausted, nearly out of ammunition. Blackwood would have men watching every town, every water source. The smart play was to run, head for Mexico, maybe, or lose themselves in the mining camps of Arizona, leave Daniel to his fate and save themselves. But looking at Margaret's face in the firelight, seeing the determination that pain couldn't erase, Sam knew running wasn't an option. They'd come too far, sacrificed too much. And somewhere in Blackwood's compound, a 12-year-old boy waited for a rescue that might never come. The desert wind picked up, howling through the wash like the voices of all the ghosts this land had claimed. Sam checked his weapons, counting bullets he didn't have enough of, planning for odds that couldn't be overcome. But he'd been in tight spots before. The key was to stop thinking like prey and start thinking like a predator. Blackwood expected them to run, to hide, to die slowly in the desert. Time to disappoint him. "How are you with that .38? He asked when Margaret stirred. "Good enough," she said, struggling to sit up. "Why? Because come morning, we're going to stop running." Sam's smile was grim in the firelight. "Blackwood wants a war. Let's give him one." Margaret studied his face, then nodded slowly. "Tell me the plan." As the stars wheeled overhead and coyotes sang their ancient songs, Sam outlined his desperate strategy. It was risky, probably suicidal, but it was the last thing Blackwood would expect. And sometimes, in this hard land, the unexpected was the only edge you had. The desert night wrapped around them like a shroud, but within it, two battered souls planned revolution. By dawn, they would either be dead or Daniel would be free. There was no middle ground left, no room for compromise. The time for running was over. The time for reckoning had come. The town of Millfield appeared like a mirage in the morning heat. Its weathered buildings clustered around a dusty main street. Sam and Margaret approached cautiously, keeping to the shadows cast by the feed store and blacksmith shop. They'd ridden through the night, Margaret gritting her teeth against the pain of her wound, both of them running on determination alone. Sam had remembered something during their desperate flight. Judge Theodore Brennan, a circuit judge who made Millfield his base between court sessions. Years ago, Sam had testified in Brennan's court about a cattle rustling case. The judge had impressed him as one of the few honest men in a territory full of corruption. "Wait here," Sam told Margaret, helping her into an alley between two buildings. "I'll find the judge." But Margaret caught his arm. "Together. We do this together." Sam wanted to argue, but saw the steel in her eyes. She'd earned the right to face this head-on. They tied their horses and walked down the street, Sam's hand never far from his gun. The courthouse was a modest adobe building with thick walls designed to stay cool in the desert heat. Inside, they found Judge Brennan in his chambers. a small room lined with the law books and papers. He was a tall, lean man in his 60s, with silver hair and sharp blue eyes that missed nothing. "Sam Morrison," the judge said, rising from his desk. "Haven't seen you in 3 years. You look like you've been rode hard and put up wet." "Judge," Sam nodded. "We need help. Legal help." Brennan's eyes moved to Margaret, taking in her pale face and the way she held her side. "Sit down. Both of you. Tell me everything." For the next hour, Margaret told her story. The false debts, her mother's death, her brother's captivity, the attempted sale in Clearwater Junction. She spoke clearly and precisely, even producing a few documents she'd managed to grab during their escape from the farm, papers that showed discrepancies in Blackwood's claims. The judge listened without interruption, occasionally making notes. When Margaret finished, he leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled. "Josiah Blackwood," he said quietly. "I've had suspicions about that man for years, never enough proof to act on, but this," he gestured to the papers, "this might be enough. The question is whether you'll live long enough to testify." "We need Daniel out of there," Margaret said. "My brother, he's just 12. Brennan stood, pacing to the window. "I can issue a writ for the boy's release, but serving it is another matter. Blackwood's ranch is a fortress. The sheriff here is a good man, but he doesn't have the men to face down Blackwood's hired guns." "What about the federal marshals?" Sam asked. "Nearest one is in Tucson, 4 days' ride." The judge turned back to them. "By then, Blackwood will have moved the boy or worse." Margaret made a sound of despair, and Sam put a steadying hand on her shoulder. But Brennan wasn't finished. "However," he said slowly, "there might be another way. Blackwood has powerful friends, but he also has enemies. Men he's cheated, families he's destroyed. If we could gather them, make this a community matter rather than a legal one." "A posse?" Sam asked. "More than that? A reckoning?" Brennan's eyes glinted. "Give me 2 days. Stay out of sight. There's a safe house at the old Martinez Ranch, 5 miles south. I'll send word when I have news." 2 days. Sam looked at Margaret, saw her jaw set with determination despite her pain. They'd come this far. "We'll be there," he said. The Martinez Ranch was abandoned but solid, with a good well and walls that would stop bullets. Sam tended Margaret's wound, relieved to see it was healing clean. They rested, planned, and waited, time crawling by with agonizing slowness. On the second night, a rider approached. Sheriff Tom Garrett, a grizzled veteran with honest eyes. "Judge sent me," he said. "You've stirred up a hornet's nest. Blackwood's men have been riding through town, making threats, but you've also given courage to folks who've been afraid for too long." "How many?" Sam asked. 17 men willing to ride. Not gunfighters, mostly farmers, shopkeepers, men Blackwood has wronged, but they're determined." Garrett studied them. "Judge has a plan, legal-like, but with force to back it up. You two willing to see this through?" "Yes," Margaret said before Sam could answer. The next morning, they rode back to Millfield to find a transformed town. Men with rifles stood on corners. Wagons were pulled across strategic points. Judge Brennan had turned the town into a courtroom and a fortress combined. "Blackwood's been summoned to appear," Brennan explained. "Charges of fraud, false imprisonment, and murder. He'll come. His pride won't let him ignore a legal challenge. But he'll come armed." "And Daniel?" Margaret asked anxiously. "The writ demands he bring the boy. Whether he will." Brennan shrugged. "We'll be ready either way." They didn't have long to wait. Near noon, a dust cloud announced Blackwood's arrival. He came with 15 men, all armed, their horses fresh and their faces hard. Blackwood himself rode in front, dressed in his finest suit, as if attending a social function rather than a legal proceeding. The courthouse square filled with tension thick enough to cut. On one side, Blackwood's hired guns spread out, hands near their weapons. On the other, the townspeople stood firm, fear in their eyes, but rifles in their hands. "Judge Brennan," Blackwood called out, his voice carrying across the square. "I understand you've been listening to lies from a thief and a woman of questionable virtue." Sam had to physically restrain Margaret from charging forward. Brennan appeared on the courthouse steps, wearing his judicial robes. "Josiah Blackwood, you've been charged with serious crimes. You'll answer them in a court of law." "I don't recognize your authority in this matter," Blackwood sneered. "The girl owes me money. The drifter interfered in legal business. Then you won't mind presenting your evidence." Brennan said calmly, "And producing Daniel O'Brien as the writ commands." Blackwood's face darkened. "The boy's my legal ward. I don't have to—" "He's my brother." Margaret stepped forward, breaking free of Sam's grip. "You murdered our mother and stole him." The square erupted. Blackwood's men went for their guns, but found themselves facing dozens of rifles from windows and rooftops. The townspeople had the high ground. "Nobody moves," Sheriff Garrett commanded, his own weapon trained on Blackwood. "This is legal business." For a long moment, violence trembled on a knife's edge. Then Blackwood laughed, an ugly sound. "You want the boy? Fine." He gestured to one of his men. "Bring him." Sam's heart sank as he saw the rider return not with Daniel, but with a piece of paper. "Bill of sale," Blackwood announced. "Sold the boy to a ranch in Mexico 3 days ago. All legal and proper. He's beyond your reach now. Judge." Margaret made a sound like a wounded animal. Sam caught her as her knees buckled, his own rage threatening to overwhelm reason. But Judge Brennan wasn't finished. "Interesting, because according to the testimony of one of your own men, Mr. Garrett, who you left wounded in the desert, Daniel O'Brien is still at your ranch. He was quite specific about seeing the boy yesterday." Blackwood's face went white, then red with fury. He'd been outmaneuvered. "Furthermore," Brennan continued, "we have evidence of systematic fraud, documents showing false claims against numerous families. The federal marshal has been notified and is en route with a warrant for your arrest." "You can't prove anything," Blackwood snarled, but uncertainty flickered in his eyes. "Can't I?" Brennan held up a leather portfolio. "Your former bookkeeper, Mr. Silas Worth, has been very helpful. Seems he kept copies of everything, including records of bribes to local officials." The game was up, and Blackwood knew it. His men sensed it too, some already edging their horses backward. "I'll see you all in hell," Blackwood spat, then wheeled his horse, back to the ranch. But as his men turned to follow, Sheriff Garrett fired a shot in the air. "Nobody leaves until we have the boy." What followed happened fast. One of Blackwood's men, younger than the others, suddenly broke ranks. "I can't do this anymore," he shouted. "The boy's in the root cellar at the ranch, locked in for 3 days now." Blackwood pulled his gun to shoot the betrayer, but Sam's Colt spoke first. The weapon flew from Blackwood's hand as he cursed in pain. In seconds, the square became a battlefield as Blackwood's men, caught in a crossfire, threw down their weapons. "It's over, Blackwood." Judge Brennan declared, "Sheriff, take him into custody." But Blackwood had one card left, even with a wounded hand. He was fast. He lunged from his horse, grabbing Margaret before anyone could react. A hidden derringer pressed to her temple. "I'm leaving," he snarled. "Anyone follows, she dies." Sam stood frozen, his gun half raised but useless. One wrong move and Margaret was dead. He met her eyes, saw not fear but trust. "Sam," she said quietly, "remember what you taught me about shooting." And he did. In that split second, he understood. He taught her to shoot low when nervous, that most people pulled high under stress. Margaret's hand, seemingly trapped at her side, held the .38 he'd given her. She fired through her coat pocket. The bullet took Blackwood in the thigh, spinning him away. Sam's follow-up shot was unnecessary. Sheriff Garrett and 3 others had already put the man down. In the sudden silence, Margaret stood swaying. Powder burns on her coat, but alive. Sam reached her in 3 strides, catching her as reaction set in. "It's done," he said softly. "It's over." But she shook her head, tears streaming. Not until Daniel's safe. Not until he's home. Judge Brennan was already organizing. Within an hour, a posse of 20 men rode for Blackwood's ranch. They met no resistance, with their leader dead and the law against them. Blackwood's remaining men had fled. They found Daniel O'Brien in the root cellar, just as the young gunman had said, thin, frightened, but unharmed. When Margaret saw him, she flew from her horse despite her wound, and the siblings' reunion brought tears to hardened men's eyes. "Maggie," the boy said wonderingly, "you came for me?" "Always," she whispered, holding him tight. "Always." Sam stood back, watching, feeling something ease in his chest. They'd done it, against all odds. They'd brought justice to this corner of the frontier. Judge Brennan approached him. "You did a good thing here. Morrison, this territory needs more men like you." Sam shook his head. "Just a drifter who couldn't mind his own business. Maybe, or maybe a man who remembered what matters." The judge smiled. "Either way, Blackwood's assets will be liquidated to compensate his victims. The O'Brien farm will be returned to its rightful owners, though I suspect they might prefer a fresh start elsewhere." Sam looked at Margaret, now introducing Daniel to the men who'd risked everything to save him. She caught his eye and smiled, a world of possibility in that look. "Yeah," Sam said quietly. "A fresh start sounds about right." The courtroom in Millfield had never seen such a crowd. Every seat was taken, with more people standing along the walls and spilling out into the street. Word had spread across the territory about the trial that would finally bring justice to those wronged by Josiah Blackwood's empire of cruelty. Judge Theodore Brennan presided with solemn dignity, his robes a symbol of the law's reach even into this rough frontier. At the defendant's table sat 3 of Blackwood's surviving lieutenants, including his foreman Garrett, whose shoulder still bore Sam's bullet. Blackwood himself lay in the cemetery, unmourned save by those who'd profited from his schemes. Margaret sat in the witness chair, wearing a simple black dress that Mrs. Morrison from the boarding house had lent her. Her hands were steady as she held the Bible, but Sam could see the tension in her shoulders. Daniel sat beside him in the gallery, the boy's eyes never leaving his sister. "State your name for the record." The prosecutor, a young lawyer named William Hartley who'd arrived from Tucson, began. "Margaret Catherine O'Brien. Miss O'Brien, please tell the court about the events leading to your family's involvement with Josiah Blackwood." Margaret's voice started soft but grew stronger as she spoke. She told of her father's death, the struggle to keep their farm, Blackwood's arrival with papers claiming debts they'd never incurred. The courtroom was silent as she described her mother's death. No longer the accident Blackwood had claimed, but murder witnessed by a terrified daughter hiding in the root cellar. "He pushed her," Margaret said clearly, "when Mama refused to sign over the deed. When she said she'd go to the territorial authorities, he pushed her down the porch steps." Her head hit the cornerstone. A murmur ran through the crowd. Sam watched the defendants shift uneasily. "What happened then?" Hartley prompted gently. "Blackwood's men took Daniel, said he'd work off our supposed debts. When I tried to stop them, they beat me." Margaret's hand unconsciously moved to her ribs. "Then Blackwood decided I'd serve better as an example to others. He kept me at his ranch for 3 weeks before taking me to Clearwater Junction." "And what happened in Clearwater Junction?" Margaret's eyes found Sam in the crowd. "Mr. Morrison bought my freedom. He didn't know me, had no obligation, but he spent his own money to free me. Then he risked his life to help me save Daniel." The testimony continued for 2 hours. Margaret produced documents she'd managed to save. Her father's real loan papers showing all debts paid. Forged documents in Blackwood's hand. Even a letter her mother had started to the federal marshal that was never sent. When the defense attorney, a nervous man brought in from Phoenix, tried to shake her story, Margaret held firm. She answered each challenge with calm certainty, her months of hardship having forged her into someone who would not be intimidated. Other witnesses followed. The young gunman who'd revealed Daniel's location testified about Blackwood's operations, the false debts, the families driven from their homes. Silas Worth, Blackwood's former bookkeeper, brought ledgers showing the full scope of the fraud dozens of families cheated, their land stolen through forged documents and threatened violence. Sam himself took the stand, describing the pursuit through the desert, the attempts on their lives, the siege at the rocks. His testimony was brief and factual, but the judge's eyes sharpened when Sam described finding Margaret in chains. The territory outlawed debt bondage in 1868, Judge Brennan noted. Yet this practice continued openly? Yes, Your Honor. Sam replied. Seemed everyone knew, but nobody could do anything about it. The trial took 3 days. By the end, the evidence was overwhelming. Blackwood's lieutenants were found guilty of fraud, false imprisonment, and conspiracy to commit murder. 2 were sentenced to 20 years in the territorial prison. Garrett, who'd shown remorse and cooperated with authorities, received 10 years, but the trial's end was just the beginning of a larger reckoning. Judge Brennan ordered Blackwood's assets liquidated and distributed among his victims. The O'Brien farm was returned to Margaret and Daniel, along with compensation for their mother's death and their suffering. After the verdict, the crowd spilled into the street in celebration. Families who'd lost everything saw hope of restitution. Men shook Sam's hand. Women hugged Margaret, and Daniel found himself hoisted on shoulders as a symbol of justice prevailing. That evening, in the quiet of the boarding house parlor, Margaret and Sam finally had a moment alone while Daniel slept upstairs, exhausted by the emotions of the day. "It's over," Margaret said wonderingly. "Really over." "The trial is," Sam agreed. "But you've got decisions to make now. The farm is yours again." Margaret stared into the fireplace. "I can't go back there. Too many ghosts. And Daniel, he needs schooling. A chance at the life Papa dreamed of for him." "What will you do?" She turned to him, and Sam saw she'd already decided. "Judge Brennan says the compensation money is enough to start fresh somewhere else. Maybe California, or..." She paused, then pushed on. "Or maybe Montana territory. I hear there's good land there for ranching." Sam's heart skipped, but he kept his voice level. "That's a hard life. Montana winters are brutal, and starting a ranch takes more than money." "I know." Margaret stood, moving to the window. "It takes someone who knows the land, understands horses and cattle, someone steady and reliable." She turned back to him. "Know anyone like that?" The question hung between them like a challenge. Sam thought of all the reasons to say no. The danger they'd been through was nothing compared to the daily struggle of building a life together. He was a drifter. She was quality. He was 12 years older, set in his ways, but then he thought of the courage she'd shown, the steel beneath the softness, the way she'd stood by him in danger, the trust in her eyes when she'd fired that shot to save them both, the way she made him want to be better than he was. "Might know someone," he said finally, "but he'd want a full partner, not just a hired hand, someone willing to work sunrise to sunset, face whatever comes, and he'd want to do things proper-like." Margaret crossed to him, taking his weathered hands in her smaller ones. "I've faced down gunmen and crossed deserts. I think I can handle Montana winters. As for proper," she smiled. "Judge Brennan is authorized to perform marriages. He mentioned it earlier, several times, actually." Sam pulled her close, marveling at how right she felt in his arms. "You sure about this? You and Daniel deserve better than..." She silenced him with a kiss, gentle but certain. "You gave me freedom when I had none. You gave me hope when all seemed lost. You gave my brother back his life. Samuel Morrison, you're the best man I've ever known. I love you," he said simply, the words rusty from disuse but heartfelt. "I know," she whispered. "I love you too." A throat cleared from the doorway. Daniel stood there in his nightshirt, grinning. "Does this mean we're going to Montana?" Margaret laughed, holding out an arm to include him in their embrace. "What do you think? Want to be a rancher?" "Will there be books?" the boy asked seriously. "All the books you can read." Sam promised, maybe even a school nearby. Daniel considered this. "Then yes, but I have one condition." "What's that?" Margaret asked. I get to stand with Sam at the wedding. Someone needs to make sure he doesn't run off. Sam ruffled the boy's hair. No danger of that. Partner, your sister's got me roped good and proper. The next morning, Millfield witnessed its second big event of the week. Judge Brennan performed the ceremony in the courthouse, with Sheriff Garrett as witness and half the town in attendance. Margaret wore her mother's wedding dress, carefully preserved and hastily altered by the boarding house ladies. Sam had found a proper suit, though he tugged at the collar like it was strangling him. When Judge Brennan pronounced them husband and wife, the cheer that went up could be heard clear to the territorial capital. Justice had been served in more ways than one. As they signed the marriage certificate, Margaret whispered to Sam, "Remember what I said that night by the campfire about it being a simple transaction?" "I remember. I was wrong. You didn't buy my freedom. You gave me yours in return." She smiled up at him. "Fair trade? Best deal I ever made," Sam said, and kissed his bride while the crowd erupted in celebration. Outside, 3 horses stood saddled and ready. Sam's reliable bay, a gentle mare for Margaret, and a sturdy pinto for Daniel. Their few possessions were packed, supplies purchased, and a map to Montana territory tucked safely in Sam's vest. The O'Brien farm would be sold to a young couple looking for a fresh start, the money added to their stake for the future. Millfield had offered them a home, but both Sam and Margaret knew they needed distance from the memories, both bitter and sweet. As they prepared to mount up, people pressed forward with gifts, preserved food, warm blankets, even a few precious books for Daniel. These people who had so little gave what they could to the family that had shown them courage was possible. "Ready?" Sam asked, helping Margaret into her saddle. She looked down at him, this man who'd changed everything with 3 words in a dusty auction. "I've been ready since you bought my freedom." "Bought our future," he corrected, swinging onto his own horse. They rode out of Millfield as the sun climbed toward noon. 3 figures heading north toward promise and possibility. Behind them lay justice served and wounds beginning to heal. Ahead stretched the vast territory of hopes and dreams, where a drifter could become a rancher, where a frightened girl could become a cherished wife, where a boy could grow into whatever he chose to be. The desert gave way to grasslands, and grasslands would give way to mountains. Somewhere in Montana, a piece of land waited for the Morrison family to make it home. The journey would be long, the work hard, but they would face it together. Justice had brought them together. Love would keep them strong. And in the vast tapestry of the American frontier, their thread would weave a story of courage, redemption, and the triumph of hope over cruelty. The trail to Montana stretched endlessly before them, winding through valleys of sage and juniper, climbing into pine-covered mountains, crossing rivers that ran cold and clear from distant peaks. It had been 2 months since they'd left Millfield, 2 months of steady progress toward a new life. They made camp that evening beside a creek in southern Colorado, the Rockies rising like ramparts to the west. Daniel tended the horses while Margaret prepared their simple meal. Sam sat on a fallen log, studying the map by firelight. "Another 3 weeks, maybe 4 if weather holds," he said. "We'll reach the Yellowstone Valley before the first snow." Margaret settled beside him, her presence as natural now as breathing. The wedding ring on her finger caught the firelight, a simple band Sam had bought in a trading post, but she wore it like it was made of finest gold. "Are you sure about the land near Billings?" she asked. "The man at Fort Collins said there's good property available closer to Helena. Billings region has better grass for horses," Sam explained. "And it's growing fast with the railroad coming through. Good market for what we raise." Daniel joined them, his face bright with excitement. "The trader said there's a school in Billings, a real school with a library." Sam smiled at the boy's enthusiasm. In the weeks of travel, Daniel had proven himself invaluable. Quick to learn, eager to help, never complaining even when days were long and conditions harsh. He'd grown 2 inches already, filling out with good food and hard work. "Education's important," Sam agreed. "Your PA was right about that. Man needs learning as much as muscle out here. They talked of plans as stars emerged overhead. The house they'd build, starting small but sturdy, the horse breeding program Sam envisioned, the vegetable garden Margaret wanted. Dreams that seemed more real with each mile traveled. That night, as Daniel slept, and Sam kept first watch, Margaret joined him at the fire's edge. "No regrets?" she asked softly. Sam pulled her close. "Only one, that I didn't find you sooner." She laughed quietly. "You found me exactly when you were meant to. Any sooner and I might not have been ready. Any later." She shuddered slightly. "No looking back," Sam said firmly. "Only forward." A coyote howled in the distance, answered by another. The sound no longer seemed threatening, just part of the vast wilderness they were making their own. 2 weeks later, they crested a rise and saw it, the Yellowstone Valley spreading before them like a promised land. The river wound silver through cottonwood groves, while grasslands rolled to distant mountains. It was everything Sam had described and more. "Oh," Margaret breathed. "It's beautiful." "Home," Daniel said simply, and Sam felt something tight in his chest ease at the word. They found the land Sam had heard about, 160 acres of prime grazing with good water access, available for homesteading. The previous claimant had given up after one winter, but Sam saw potential where others saw hardship. They filed their claim in the tiny town of Coulson, soon to be renamed Billings. The clerk, a thin man named Peterson, examined their papers carefully. "Morrison," he mused. "You the Sam Morrison who faced down Josiah Blackwood." News traveled even to Montana territory. It seemed... Sam nodded reluctantly. Peterson's face split in a grin. "Then you're the kind of folks we need here. Welcome to Montana." The first weeks were a whirlwind of activity. They lived in their tent while Sam and Daniel built a one-room cabin, racing against the changing season. Margaret worked alongside them when not preparing meals or organizing their supplies. Neighbors appeared as if from nowhere. The Thompsons, from the next valley over. The Kowalski family, who ran sheep to the east. Old Jim Bridger, who trapped in the mountains. Each brought gifts, tools, preserved food, advice freely given. The frontier was hard, but it bred a generosity born of shared struggle. When the Morrisons' cabin was ready for raising, a dozen men appeared to help, their wives bringing food for the celebration after. "You've got good land here," Tom Thompson told Sam as they secured the roof beams. "Sheltered from the worst winds. Plenty of grass. You picked well." Sam glanced at Margaret, who was laughing with the other women as they prepared dinner. "I've been lucky in my choices lately." The cabin was small but solid, one room with a stone fireplace. Real glass windows that had cost dear but would keep out winter's bite. A wooden floor instead of dirt. They moved in as the first frost silvered the grass, Daniel proudly claiming the loft space as his own. That first night in their new home, they sat before the fire, exhausted but content. "We did it," Margaret said wonderingly. "We actually did it." "This is just the beginning," Sam warned. "Winter's coming, and Montana winter is no joke. Then spring will bring its own challenges, buying stock, breaking ground for planting, building corrals." "I know." She took his hand. "But we'll face it together. The three of us." Daniel looked up from the book he was reading. A gift from the school teacher in town who'd been delighted to learn of a new pupil. "4 of us, maybe?" Margaret blushed while Sam coughed. "What makes you say that, boy?" "I'm not blind," Daniel said with 12-year-old wisdom. "Margaret's been sick in the mornings. And Mrs." Thompson kept smiling at her and patting her hand. Sam looked at his wife, who nodded shyly. "I was going to tell you tonight. The doctor in town confirmed it. Come spring, there'll be another Morrison on the ranch." Sam pulled her into his arms. Joy and terror warring in his chest. A baby. Out here on the frontier. But then, hadn't life always been uncertain? At least here, any child of theirs would grow up free, with clean air and open sky, and parents who'd fought for the right to love each other. "Well then," he said gruffly, emotion thick in his voice, "guess I'd better build another room come spring." Winter arrived with a vengeance. Snow piling deep. Temperatures dropping until the creek froze solid. But their little cabin stayed warm, filled with lamplight and laughter. Sam taught Daniel to work leather and mend harness. Margaret sewed baby clothes and told stories of Ireland that her mother had passed down. They read aloud in the evenings, newspapers when they could get them, books treasured and reread, the Bible on Sundays. The worst storm came in February, wind howling like demons, snow falling so thick they couldn't see the barn. Sam strung rope between buildings so he could tend the horses they'd bought in fall. For 3 days they were trapped inside, but instead of despair, Sam felt only gratitude for the solid walls around them and the family within. When spring finally came, it arrived in a rush of snowmelt and green grass. Sam hired the Thompson boys to help build an addition to the cabin, a proper bedroom and a small room for the baby. Margaret planted her garden, coaxing vegetables from soil that had never known cultivation. Daniel, when not in school, helped Sam with the horses, showing a natural gift for handling the animals. And on a warm May morning, with the doctor from town and Mrs. Thompson attending, Sarah Margaret Morrison entered the world with a cry that Sam swore could be heard clear to the mountains. "She's perfect," Margaret whispered, exhausted but radiant. Sam held his daughter with hands that trembled, this tiny life more precious than all the gold he'd never found. "Sarah," he said softly, "for the sister I lost, may she have a better chance." Summer brought prosperity. The horses Sam had bought were good stock, and word spread of the quality animals at the Morrison Ranch. They sold 2 colts for enough to buy more breeding stock and still have money saved. The garden flourished, Margaret canning and preserving for the winter ahead. Daniel, promoted to the next level at school, spent his free time teaching other children to read. One evening in late August, as they sat on the porch Sam had built, watching the sun paint the mountains purple and gold, Margaret spoke the words that had been in Sam's mind. "We've come so far from that day in Clearwater Junction." Sam shifted baby Sarah to his other arm, the child gurgling contentedly. "Sometimes feels like a lifetime ago. Sometimes like yesterday. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you'd walked away?" "Every day," Sam admitted. "And every day I thank God I didn't." Daniel emerged from the house, carrying the guitar Sam had been teaching him to play. "Ma, tell the story again, about how Pa rescued you." Margaret smiled. "Which version? The one where he was a heroic knight, or the one where he was a stubborn fool who couldn't mind his own business?" "Both are true," Sam said, pulling her close with his free arm, as Daniel played a simple melody and Sarah dozed in her father's arms. Margaret began the story they all knew by heart, but never tired of hearing. How a drifter became a hero, how a transaction became a transformation, how desperation became hope and hope became love. The story ended, as always, with Margaret's whispered words that had started it all. "Please, buy me and take me away." "And I did," Sam would always conclude. "Best money I ever spent." Now, in the peace of a Montana evening, with their land stretching around them and their future bright with promise, those desperate words had transformed into something else entirely. Not a plea from the hopeless, but a reminder of how far courage could carry you, how love could grow from the rockiest ground. Margaret stood, taking Sarah inside for her evening feeding. Daniel followed, still practicing his guitar. Sam remained on the porch, watching the first stars appear. A year ago, he'd been a man without connections, drifting like tumbleweed across the frontier. Now he had roots deeper than any he'd imagined possible. A wife who was his true partner. Children who gave meaning to every sunrise. Land that would nurture generations to come. The Wild West was changing, growing civilized with each passing year. The railroad brought new settlers. Towns grew into cities, and law replaced the gun. But some things remained constant: the value of courage, the power of justice, the strength found in family. Sam Morrison had bought a girl's freedom for $300. In return, he'd gained a life worth more than all the gold in California. It was, as he told Daniel, the best deal he'd ever made. As he rose to join his family inside, Sam paused at the door for one last look at the land they'd claimed together. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. Horses to train, crops to tend, children to raise. But tonight, there was peace. Inside, lamplight spilled golden through the windows, and Margaret's voice rose in an Irish lullaby as she rocked their daughter. Daniel's guitar joined in, hesitant but true. Sam stepped through the door, adding his rough baritone to the music. The Morrison Ranch settled into night, one small point of light in the vast Montana darkness, but it was enough. They had made it enough. In years to come, the story would be told and retold, at church socials and around campfires, in letters to relatives back east, and eventually in Daniel's own written account. How love conquered cruelty, how justice prevailed against odds, how 3 broken people became a family whole. But for now, in this moment, they simply lived it, and that was miracle enough. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the Old West. I hope Sam and Margaret's story touched your heart as it did mine. Where are you listening to this tale? Please share in the comments below. I'd love to know if you're by a cozy fireplace, on your daily commute, or perhaps even somewhere out in the wide open spaces that our characters called home. Don't forget to subscribe to From Wild West channel and share your thoughts on their incredible journey. Until next time, partners, keep riding toward your own horizons.